In fact, if we go to this next slide, I think you can see here one of the features of this particular case is that they construct or designed this house after several redesigns actually to be over what began as 7 and then became 6 iwi kupuna, individual iwi kupuna burials. And you can see from this diagram where they're located, basically clustered around this central area of the footprint of the house, where 6 burials are located. I left out the one at the very bottom of the screen, burial number 30, because ultimately, as you'll see, a revision to this plan eventually put it outside directly of the footprint, but not by much, as we'll see later. But this was the central controversy. Even though there are 23 other burials on this 18,000 square foot parcel in the backyard, basically, toward the ocean, these 6 in this red circle constituted the key areas of concern, even though, as all archaeologists, Ms. McMahon, Mr. Dega, and others were clearly of the opinion that there were many more in this location. Even in fact, in between these very 6 burials that are circled here underneath the footprint of the house. But that became a very contentious point because even though 6 were there, nobody was acknowledging, well, neither Mr. Brescia or Ms. McMahon seemed to be interested in determining the extent of this burial, in other words, the density of burials, and in fact were studious about redesigning their footings so they wouldn't go as deep and therefore avoid hitting burials during construction. If they dug 6 feet, they knew they might be hitting. I think the evidence on the record was that over half of the 30 burials were at depths of about 2 meters. And so the testimony that came out during the cross-examination of Dr. Dega was that he, upon finding these 30, then went back to the engineers and architects, redesigned their footings to be shallower, located at a meter depth, deliberately so that they would not so-called disturb the remaining burials as if they aren't disturbed already by building on top of them. So this became a key issue about whether or not the Historic Preservation Division especially had a duty to try to get as much information about this burial site. And I think maybe they can explain why is that important about knowing just how many burials are there and studiously trying to avoid them, in other words, during the process of construction. Why was that legally significant as an attempt to try to, as they say, not disturb those burials?
Well, they're trying to say that we want to disturb as least amount of burials as possible. And that would be a good thing if they were making the decision and allowing the burial council to make a decision based on an estimate of what might be there. But instead, they're limiting the decision to what has actually been found. And so if they're deliberately avoiding finding burials and then they're only allowing a decision on the ones that are found, they're really minimizing the scope of what the council can do. And
it's also depriving them of information, I think, at the same time, right?
And it puts other burials at risk. And as we learned later, as a dust fence was going up between the Brescia property and the next door property that belongs to Anthony Kiedis, they encountered another burial. And because they're going in there with, for the first 30, it was with the backhoe, and with the dust fence, I'm not sure what they used, but they're actually can damage the iwi as they're encountering them. And so we know already that there's more. They're expecting there to be more. They're trying to avoid them, but they're not, they're still...
They can't help themselves.
They can't, they're still running into them. So their attempt to disturb fewer is actually not helping the situation.
Right. And I think as this next slide shows, this conundrum of trying to avoid the full measure of information around a burial site really is clearly at odds with what the law intends, which is that you got to know what this site is and how much it contains and how dense the burials are so that the proper protections can be afforded to the burial site. But instead of having this treated as a cemetery, we're now talking which is of one whole, cemetery, and treating it that way, you're now treating 30 individual burial sites under the SHPD approach of doing this. But we also learned that what SHPD then determined after the Burial Council acted was quite at odds with what the Burial Council figured had to happen. Can you explain to the audience, Camille, a little bit about what happened, the sequence from late 2007 through April of 2008? What was occurring?
There was a lot of things going on because at the same time as Mr. Brescia was applying for permits to build, there was a court proceeding, a court case that was trying to determine the proper shoreline that he was supposed to follow for his plans. And so he initially got approval from the Planning Commission for his first house design, I believe, in February of 2007. After that, he started doing his archaeological inventory survey in March. In July of 2007, the Supreme Court issued its decision about where the shoreline should be. And so he had to redesign his property again, or his house.
And just to pause right there, but there was a lot of background events going on here. Mr. Brescia is very prominent in the legal world because he is now known amongst attorneys who are familiar with shoreline protection issues as the man who tried to push the shoreline as close to the ocean as possible, oftentimes illegally. And this was important because the shoreline, as many would know, is the property line between the public property, the public trust resource that is the shoreline area versus the private property line that is just Malka of that certified shoreline. But he went through basically 2 rounds of this, lost twice before the Supreme Court, and in this latest instance was forced to push back his house, I believe, 70 feet as a result. But go ahead.